I apologize for not being able to speak Spanish. I feel very humbled to be introduced in another language. And if there's any questions or any problems, please put it in the chat, or Andrea, just jump in. I can kind of understand Spanish, Italian, Portuguese from living and working in Latin America and Italy in college. So thank you for the nice introduction, Andrea, and for explaining the logistics today. I'm really excited about this presentation to all of you. So welcome and thanks for joining. I'm just going to jump right into it. This will take 90 minutes to 2 hours, and I'm going to explain who I am and why I'm speaking to you. I'm going to explain what drone journalism is, what drone storytelling is. We're going to talk about how to fly a drone. We're going to talk about how to take photos, process your images with editing software. We're going to talk about drone mapping. And essentially, I'm going to give you a primer on why you would want to use a drone to tell stories, whether about your own community, your own lives, some issue that's going on in your town or your region, because I feel like drones are this profoundly democratic and novel technology that has changed my life, and I really hope changes yours. And as Andrea said, hopefully you can join me in person, or I should say join us in person next week in Mexico, and then further on if you're joining us from Argentina in November. So let me share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. Andrea, does that look good? Okay, good. And yes, I apologize for there being a margin at the top there. I'm sorry about that. So that's my name, Johnny Miller. Again, I co-founded an NGO in South Africa, where I'm based in Cape Town, called AfricanDRONE. And I'll talk about that. And then I'll also talk about my project, Unequal Scenes. Unequal Scenes is kind of probably the reason why most people know me for drone journalism. I'll talk about it just now, but it's a great example of having an idea and then using a drone to go actualize that idea. So I'm hoping that that sparks some interest in all of you with your own work, wherever you're based. So we talked about the introduction of what we're going to do in the next couple minutes here, in the next 90 minutes, but essentially I broke it down into 3 modules. So I'm going to talk about drone storytelling. I know probably a lot of you want to just jump in and learn how to fly a drone, but I really think it's important because of the fact that drones are expensive. They can be risky to use. There can be legal issues with using drones. We really have to talk carefully about why you would want to use a drone in the first place. Is it worth it? And what are completely like all the ramifications of using that technology to tell a story? Then we'll move into the actual flight techniques, capturing data, the photos, the videos, editing. That's critical when we're talking about drone stories. And then move into mapping, which a lot of people don't realize drones can do really, really well. But I think it's kind of the most interesting way to use a drone in some respects. So let's just start right off with drone storytelling. Basically, what I'm going to give to you now is sort of the meaning and the way that people are using it right now around the world. We'll pay special attention to air law. I'm sure a lot of you realize that using drones isn't as easy as just using a camera. You have to pay attention to not only the ethics of how you're using the drone, but then also the air law, which actually surrounds how you use the drone legally, because drones are normally classified the same way that aircraft are around the world. I know specifically in Mexico and America and South Africa, they are classified that way. And I believe in Argentina as well. Every country I've been to, they're classified as small aircraft. So that has a whole other sort of can of worms that we need to talk about. And then we'll go into hardware and software and other integrations. So let's just jump right into it. Drone storytelling. What do I mean by drone storytelling? It's basically a remarkable new way of using technology to utilize a new vantage point and to tell stories using new data in your own existing workflow. So I find this very democratic. Over the last 7 or 8 years since I've been working with drones, they become increasingly affordable, increasingly powerful, increasingly safe. So drone storytelling essentially has become more and more sort of commonplace in the world. They offer unprecedented access. You can fly over the tops of walls. You can look into areas that are off limits for whatever reason or too dangerous to access on foot. The definition basically is 2 parts. So there's the drone, and then there's storytelling. Storytelling should be obvious to you, and the way that we define it is it's the production and distribution of reports on the interaction of whatever the news of the day is. So journalism is even higher regarded than storytelling because you have an ethical backstop that someone, your publishing partner or your editor, will be checking you against. Drone storytelling, you might not have that, but you should still hold yourself accountable to telling stories in an ethical, fair, and unbiased way. Smartphones have significantly changed the landscape for storytelling and journalism. So the internet and then smartphones and then camera phones, starting around 2007 or 2008, that really changed the game. And I think drones change it even further. So if you look at any news outlet and you start looking into a story that involves anything with a wide expanse, so environmental stories, climate stories, stories that talk about wide areas of populations, urban areas, you'll see drone footage in there. But when we're talking about drone storytelling, I mean using drones as a fundamental part of the storytelling process. So it's a even more of a use of drones within that story is how I'm defining drone storytelling and how we do at Code for Africa. I want to show you this video real quick. It's very short. This is the very first drone storytelling video ever showed. It was on the New York Times. And you can see how shaky the footage is. So that annoying sound was the propellers. You can see how shaky the footage was because that was 2011. That was 12 years ago now. And that was the very first time, at least on the internet that I could find, that anyone had ever used a drone to tell some sort of story in a real news organization. And that was a protest in Poland. Basically, people wanted to see what it looked like from above. And it completely changed how people started telling the news, started telling stories, because all of a sudden you didn't rely on the official photography or the official video from the state police. You could see actually what was happening in real time. You could live stream. You could have video and photo at the same time. You could switch between them, and everything was safe. You didn't have to put yourself at risk. It completely changed the game. So as I mentioned, using drones as a fundamental part of the storytelling is what we consider drone journalism. I'll give you another example here before we go into unequal scenes. In Cape Town, for example, there was a story of a sewage outfall in the ocean. And this sewage outfall was only visible by airplane or by drone. And we called it water watch, essentially. Using drones was the only way to collect this data. So the newspaper really wanted to tell the story. We wanted to tell it. It was about dumping sewage directly into a very pristine, beautiful area of Cape Town where I live, this beach. And not many people even knew that it was happening until the drone essentially became cheap enough that we could afford one and we could fly it over this area and show what was happening. Aircraft are just too expensive. So it's a good example of using drones as a fundamental part of the drone story collection, not just some add-on, photo that that it doesn't really matter if you had it or not. It's just using the technology for the sake of using it. No, what I'm encouraging you to do is to think about how to actually use the drone to fundamentally change your storytelling. Unequal Scenes is the project that I'm most known for. And I think it's worth talking about Unequal Scenes briefly because it's a great example of using drones fundamentally. So as a fundamental part of the image capture, but then also using drone journalism to change people's opinions on a particular topic, in this case, inequality. So, as a photographer, and by the way, if you're joining us from Mexico, the image on the right-hand side of the screen there is from Mexico City. That's Santa Fe. But as a photographer, I focus on inequalities. So my main job, my main profession is as a photographer. I also work with video, and it's only been the last 7 years or so that I've branched out into using drones and using different forms of storytelling to be more of a, I don't know what you would call it. I don't want to say activist, but let's just say sort of a multimedia storyteller. And oftentimes I noticed that the landscape was cut in two. There was walls, there was buildings, but it was really, really hard to see that. And I thought, well, okay, since I moved to Cape Town, I'm actually American, but I moved to Cape Town in 2012. How can I help represent those divisions in cities with the technology that I had at my disposal? So I looked at this map. Maybe you've got maps like this in your own cities, but essentially this is a demographic map taken from the census of Cape Town, and the different colors represent different racial classifications. This is just as an example of something that I was interested in at the time. So I was interested in anthropology and apartheid and urban design. All those things come together in Cape Town because during apartheid in South Africa from 1948 or so to 1994, the different races had to live separately. So white people had to live in their own neighborhoods, black people had to live in their own neighborhoods. And there was another classification called colored people. They needed to live in their own neighborhoods. And you can see, even in 2011, people still lived so separately, right? And they were divided by these highways, these walls. If you look at that map there, you can see the roads dividing different neighborhoods. And that was intentional. That wasn't organic, that was planned. So in 2016, I thought, well, why don't I take this new technology, the drone, and I had just bought my first drone. We'll talk a little bit more about how much they cost and all the things that go into that. But essentially, I saved up for a long time to get my very first drone, and the DJI Inspire drone. And I went to this location, which was about 30 kilometers from where I live. You can see from that map, it was a very dense black township. It's what we call them in South Africa, essentially a slum. And it was surrounded by white people living really quite an affluent life. So those different colors are the racial categories, by the way, in South Africa. It's not just my idea of who lives there, that the data shows that. So I went to this location, and as you can see, there was fences because it's dangerous there. So everyone lives behind fences with like barbed wire and electric wire on top of it. And it was quite difficult to understand what was going on the other side of that fence until you had the drone. And so I went to this location, I put the drone up in the air, and I ended up taking this photo. Now, I didn't think too much of it at the time, actually. This photo came to me on my screen, and I thought, wow, this is a really kind of an incredible photo. But I didn't think that it was going to do anything differently. I didn't have very many followers at the time. I had, I think, 200 people following me on my Facebook page. And I went to bed that night. And then when I woke up in the morning, this photo had gone totally viral. And within 24 hours or so, this had 1,000 shares. It had many, many hundreds of comments. It had lots of people emailing me and writing me, and a lot of people were saying there's something about this image that sort of captured exactly what people know about South Africa, about how divided it is and about how the divisions are. And then other people were arguing that it wasn't showing that at all. It was showing how people, wanted to be separate, for example, that like it was a natural selection that people decided to live on one side or the other. And other people were saying, no, no, this is an example of division from above. People have been planned and forced to live in these two camps. You can see some of the comments on the right-hand side there. If you go to my Facebook page, you can still see this image, and the comments are really incredible. Just because people, they didn't know who I was. So all they saw were these drone images, and what they read in the caption was that today I'm starting a project on inequality. And so the fact that I said that I was starting a project on inequality meant to a lot of people that there was more photos coming, that this was becoming a project. And that got people really excited. So people started messaging me. I started getting news requests for interviews. And I thought, maybe I've overstepped my boundary here. Maybe I'm like, as a foreigner, maybe I didn't know what I was talking about. But very quickly, I realized that it was important to keep going, to do these interviews, to take more photos, because people really thirsted for a new way of interacting with this issue that people really were passionate about, which was inequality and racism, essentially. I went to all the other cities in South Africa. This is from Durban. Just as a quick note, this image, it's a golf course, and the golf course is named after a man, an Indian guy, who during the 60s in South Africa was like the best golfer. Basically of all time in South Africa, he was excellent. And he beat the best white golfer at the time in a tournament. His name was Gary Player. And when he went to go get his trophy, the Indian guy, his name is Papua Sugalam, when he was going to get his trophy, a big thunderstorm rolled in off the ocean, and it started raining really, really hard, and there was lightning and thunder. And everyone, all the other golfers were white, and they ran into the building, and the building was only for white people, if you can imagine that. So the law said only white people can enter this building. So this Indian guy, Papua Sugalam, had to stand outside in the rain to get his trophy. And that photo, there was a photo taken of that, went viral around the world in the 1960s. And South Africa was sanctioned internationally. It caused a huge uproar. And essentially, the South African government punished Papua Sugalam for that and took his passport away and never let him play golf again. So in 1994, he posthumously was named as this golf course's name, Papua Sugalam Golf Course. And an informal settlement, or a slum, appeared very quickly afterwards on the side of this golf course. So to me, the reason why I'm saying this is not only because this photo has become sort of the defining image in a way of my project, and it's in a way kind of a beautiful image, if I can say that. It's well balanced, the colors are nice. People look at it on Instagram and they want to like it because they don't really know what they're looking at. But the story behind it and the fact that it was taken from a drone, I think there's no other way that you could see both sides at the same time except from the air. And telling the story behind the story, what I just told to you, really captivates people. That's really the hook that gets people deeper into a project. Lastly, well, not lastly, but just last in South Africa, I'll talk a little bit about this image also. On the right-hand side, informal settlement on a old gold mine. And then on the left-hand side, Johannesburg, the biggest city in South Africa and the most important city. And this photo actually became the cover of Time magazine. So this project really took off and became a big deal. And I started traveling all over Africa, teaching people about drone journalism, setting up AfricanDRONE, talking to people like yourselves about how to use drones for good. And that really involves explaining what I'm trying to do in terms of get across a message of storytelling using new technology rather than just talking about how to actually fly the drone. But we will talk about how to actually fly the drone. Don't worry, I'm still coming to that. But it's kind of a force multiplier. So drone technology can help even if you're in the lowest income, the kind of most marginalized communities, like this township in South Africa that I'm in now, IKI-TUC, in this photo. The drone has this ability to sort of jump higher than it could otherwise, right? To do more than a normal camera could. And I think photojournalists and storytellers, activists, lawyers, land rights people, they can really make use of this new technology to multiply their message. There's a couple more images from my project. It's gone worldwide. On the left is India, on the right, Johannesburg again. I just wanted to show you also, I was in Mexico 2 years ago. So during the height of COVID, this image on the left, also from Santa Fe, matched up perfectly with some of the data that I had seen from a friend of mine who worked for the Mexican government on infection rates from COVID. So I was able to directly draw a line from my aerial image on the left, the wealthier side of the image, across that ravine to the right-hand side, and show that the infection rates for COVID were drastically different. And you could tie economic indicators like income and wealth, home ownership, directly to health indicators such as mortality and COVID infection rates. So there's a lot of work that you can do using drone images to kind of highlight the impact. And then the central image there is from Buenos Aires. I think it's kind of obvious what I'm trying to get across here, which is that I believe inequality is bad, a severe economic inequality, and it's also systemic. So showing people that there's an issue gets them to stop and listen to your message. Listening to my message then hopefully gets a few people to change their behavior. So that's how I see the activist journey. If I consider myself an activist, which I do for this project, as a communicator, as a photographer, first we need to stop, get people to pay attention. Then we need to promote our message. Then hopefully offer them solutions or ways to change their behavior. That's the three-step process that I use. And in terms of photography, if you think about how you ingest media these days, how do you actually get images into your brain? A lot of the times it's on social media. And I try to form my images and create drone images that will stop people in their tracks when they're looking at it on a small screen. Not necessarily intentionally, but that's just kind of the game, right? So I crop and edit and add saturation and do different things to my images, which will hopefully make people stop and pay attention to them. That doesn't mean I'm photoshopping my images. It just means that that's an intentional act of mine to try to get these images to go as viral as possible. I suggest you do the same, and we'll talk a little bit about that in half an hour or so. Lastly, another few things that you might think about when you're using drones. This was the very first image that I showed to you that I took in 2016. Going back to the same place over and over, which I've done with this location, allows you to tell a story over time that can be extremely powerful. You can see in the images here how the informal settlement on the left-hand side of the image has grown and changed over the last 6-7 years. In fact, there was even a big fire there. So in the last image, you can see there's all those ordered shacks on the top hand part of the image there. That's because there was a massive fire and the city actually changed the building structure there. So if you're telling stories about climate change, if you're telling stories about urban migration or war, a variety of different stories would lend themselves to drone journalism really well. Think about going back over time as well, because oftentimes satellite imagery is available, but it's not yours. It's owned by Google or some other Earth observation company like Sentinel. So you don't technically own the images. And also, it's not that high resolution, and you might not have the same quality of image as you could do on your own. So that's oftentimes what people say, well, why don't I just use satellite imagery? For those three reasons, I would suggest using drone imagery if you can afford it, if it makes sense, if it's legal, and also if you just have the ability to, honestly, which is why we're doing this course. Hopefully you'll have it at the end. Another few stories. So there's stories of architecture. I started seeing, as a journalist and a photographer, the world very differently when I started flying drones. I started thinking, well, instead of looking at things from the ground and trying to tell human stories, what sort of stories could I tell from the air that represented the humanity, both of the people that lived in these places, but then also the people that constructed these places, the architects themselves. And in South Africa, there's a particular building style called a hostel. And the hostel actually, in a weird way, I felt was kind of beautiful from the air. Sometimes these hostels look like geometric shapes. Sometimes they look like flowers. Sometimes they look like, I don't know, scattered children's toys or blocks or something. But the story behind them, the fact that they're used or they were used to house Black laborers on the gold mines, and they were designed in such a way that people could not leave them easily. In a lot of the cases, they didn't even have windows on the outside. All the windows faced on the inside. You can maybe see, for example, the one sort of the top right, it's red. It looks like a shell. You can see it's almost got a perimeter, like a wall around it. So those are where Black men, always Black men, had to sleep. And it all faced inside. There was no doors or windows on the outside of those buildings. And everything was controlled by one access point, one exit point, and it was controlled by the owner of the mine, the security forces of the mine, the gold mines. The reason why I chose this project is because of the fact that many hundreds of thousands of people still live in these buildings, even today. And so telling stories that don't necessarily follow the standard structure of interviewing people, of taking portraits, of talking about what's happening on the ground, but rather taking it from the point of view of the architecture. It's a different into telling that terrible history that may trigger some people to think differently. This story was actually awarded a prize in South Africa, and yeah, I'm quite proud of it. So there's other infrastructure stories that I've done, like this one, talking about how in America, infrastructure has historically been used to separate Blacks and whites in American cities, but moreover, how infrastructure was built through the middle of Black communities, oftentimes, like this photo from Baltimore, which involved building a highway, which actually people don't even use, through the middle of a really vibrant Black neighborhood in the 1960s, completely changing the aspect of the neighborhood. This is some infrastructure from the drone on the left, and then on the ground on the right, where people actually built walls through the middle of their neighborhoods to separate Black and white people. And then lastly, using satellite data and historical data to kind of supplement the drone and on the ground reporting. And I actually ended up using Photoshop to compile, or I should say to composite, about 10 different satellite images. Actually, these aren't satellite images, excuse me. These are airplane images over Detroit from two different periods, and then show which neighborhoods had the highways built through them over about a 10-year span. That project also was an award winner. I'm hoping this isn't boring you to death, and I'm not trying to self-aggrandize myself and make you think that I'm like a really great journalist. I want to come across as someone who's interested in telling stories about the truth, that the way that our world is laid out. And this tool, this drone, really, really is an amazing tool to allow me to do that. And people respond when they see you doing things like this. They want to help out. They want to promote these stories. Not only is it sort of sexy, in a way because you're using new technology to tell these stories, but it's also more effective. People can understand infrastructure stories, segregation stories a lot better when they see it from the air. I think probably you, even just from looking at this image, can understand what I'm trying to say without even reading any details about it. Lastly, before we take a very short break, we don't have to watch this whole video, but essentially drone mapping is what this project is about.
We're going around with a team made up of girls from Makoko to actually collect points of interest within their neighborhood, within their houses, to put this on the map so we can have multi-layers of points of interest on this map. So we can see the streets and have easy navigation, and all of this can be on the map for free.
I'll stop it there and we can take a brief break, but I just want to explain what you just saw. So drones have the ability to take photos. Drones have the ability to take video, but drones also have the ability to take many photos and to stitch them together into a map. And we'll talk about that in the last part of this presentation. But that's really quite interesting because if you're in a place like Makoko, if you're in a place like an informal area of Mexico or Argentina that maybe has never been mapped before, and by mapped, I mean officially mapped by the state governments with airplanes, with people on the ground, or with satellites. Lots of parts of Africa are like this, by the way. I don't know necessarily the statistics on Latin America, but in Africa, it's somewhere between 70 and 80% of the entire continent has not been officially mapped. It's really quick and easy and accurate to do this with a drone. It might not be official because official requires the government to be involved, but it's accurate enough so that you can put it on humanitarian OpenStreetMaps or another website. You can have people on the ground who tell you this building is a hospital, this building is a school, here's the water points. And you can take the drone map and the map that you create on the ground with the community and put them together. And now you have a map where people can say, this is my house, that's the water point, this is the school. And that's hugely important for a variety of reasons. Storytelling, yes. Obviously, you can tell stories using a map in a more accurate way, but really more for things like land tenure in Africa, it's really important. A lot of people don't actually own officially the lands that they live on. So there's no deed to the land that they have. Emergency services, insurance companies, even the government itself for mitigating disaster risk, things like this, they need accurate maps and they need to know where people live in order to make the best decisions. So I'm hoping that these things sort of are percolating in your brain. How can I use drones to tell stories in my neighborhood best? And let's just take maybe a quick brief break. Please just jot down a couple ideas for how drone storytelling could be used in your community before we go on. I don't know, Andrea, is there anything that you wanted to say before we go on?
Yes, please, Johnny. I will ask in Spanish, and also maybe the participants have some questions for you, so I will support translating them. Okay.
Sure.
Vale, vamos a hacer una pausa de unos minutitos mientras.
A drone journalism story. Essentially, what I want to do with this section right now is to put into your mind the actual work plan that needs to be generated in order to tell one of these stories. So you've already been inspired to tell a drone storytelling story of something in your neighborhood, your region. Now I want to help you think about what practicalities need to go into actually making that happen. okay? So let's just go through these one by one. Figure out how the drone will fit into your existing production. I think it's really important to understand that drone storytelling is similar, but it's also dissimilar to other forms of storytelling. So your local context still matters, but your local political and legal jurisdiction also now matter in terms of how you're actually capturing the data, usually photographs, in the context of your stories. And not every organization is prepared or wants to embark upon this path of drone storytelling. I'm assuming since you're in the Zoom with us that you are prepared for that, but it's worth thinking about it. And we'll talk about it in more detail, what the actual sort of requirements are going to be in order to fly that drone and all the costs and legality that come around with it. But this is probably what most people think when they think of the challenges in terms of coming up with a project, which is finding a drone pilot. Who's going to be the pilot? Maybe all of you really want to be the pilots, but the pilot is ultimately the one responsible for the operation and the safety of the drone during the flight. Legally, they are the one responsible for the drone, not the organization, but the actual drone pilot, and that carries a lot of risk. So if that person isn't you, is there someone on staff or that you know that's going to help you tell the story? That's a question that you need to ask yourself. Let's see. Pre-production, flying safely and ethically, as I mentioned. Telling a drone story, it might require working with equipment and services that you're unfamiliar with. And you might have to prepare yourself to ensure success. You definitely have to prepare yourself to ensure success, which is why creating a solid production plan, a solid work plan, and we'll talk about that. That involves everyone on your team understanding their role before you begin flying to create that plan so that you can fly safely and ethically. Then, of course, you go into production. I think this is more or less kind of where it gets into what you're probably used to doing, which is actually telling the story. Your drone storytelling project comes together during the editing process. So the story relies on the same core tenets as any other story, which is voices, facts, and context. And it's important to consider all the pieces of that puzzle before you begin flying to ensure your success. You've got editing and writing, publication. So far from being an afterthought, where are you going to publish the story? This deserves special attention because your editor might have a big headache working with drone images and drone video and drone maps if they want to put this into like a traditional newspaper. We struggled at Code for Africa to get our drone stories into media because of the fact that it was quite complicated and heavy, the data that we were presenting to them. And we had to actually use a completely new website called Shorthand, which hosted all of our data, and then the actual publication partner linked to that website because their tech team just had not dealt with this before. This was 2016-17. Things are changing now, and tech teams, for example, if you're working with your local newspaper or a television channel or something like that, they're probably going to be more tech savvy with using drone footage now. But in 2016, 2017, they weren't. So that's something to think of, is how do you get your message out? If you're telling stories with drones, how does it actually go out? And then obviously promotion is the last one. How do you have a strategy for actually keeping the story in the public eye? Is that advertising? Are you spending on social media? Do you have a team of people who are promoting it, et cetera? So let's go into number one right here. This is drones fitting into your existing workflow. Drone storytelling, it requires more than just the pilots. Okay, it requires combining the skills and creating a workflow to integrate the drone data with your current workflow to produce something that has more value. So it's value add. Furthermore, drone regulations are varying widely, and some jurisdictions lack comprehensive laws. For example, in Mexico, I was doing research before this presentation. Mexico has quite opaque drone regulations. it's not 100% clear what exactly you can and can't do, for example, as a foreign drone pilot in Mexico. That's a gray area, it seems like. And a lot of countries have these gray areas. So navigating these gray areas to be able to tell your drone story is really important, that you understand the risk that you might be taking and might not be taking, especially as the pilot. Oftentimes, if you want to fly commercially, you need actually a license. It's like that in Mexico. It's like that in South Africa and like America. If you just want to fly a drone for fun, it's fine. But if you want to try to make money with your drone, if you're a professional journalist or a professional photographer and you're using drones to tell stories, you may need a license. And that license may come with training. It might come with a cost. It might come with a whole host of regulatory things that you might not be considering as a normal photographer or photojournalist who doesn't have to do any of those things. So this is a challenge. This is a challenge to newsrooms and to the individual who are thinking about embarking on this process. Let's talk about cost real quick. It's worth noting that the cost of drones has come down a lot, but that they're also expensive. They still are expensive. And not only the cost of the drone, which maybe could be about $1,000 for a, let's call it professional entry-level drone and batteries, but you also have to think that drones are now shooting in 4K video, and they have quite high megapixel still photos. And especially if you're taking drone maps, that's quite a large amount of data that the drone is outputting that you're going to have to put into storage. You're going to have a strong enough computer to edit all of that. You might need expensive subscriptions to manipulate that data, especially for drone mapping. Your newsroom might need special equipment to be able to tell these stories the best way possible. Have you considered all of these costs and put it all into your workflow calculations before you think, let's fly the drone? These are some of the skills required for a drone storytelling project. So things to think about, not just the drone pilot, but the drone safety and equipment manager. Who's going to keep the drone safe and who's going to keep you safe in the field? A GIS, geographical informational systems, or a mapping expert, someone who's going to consult with you and be able to manipulate that data that you create from a map and turn it into something useful. A photographer. Not every pilot and not every journalist is a good photographer. Not every photographer is a good pilot. So you have to find someone who can do both. Oftentimes the photographer will be the pilot. Very, very rarely will you have two controllers, one photographer and one as a pilot, although I have done that before. Videographer, same thing. Video editor, I should say photo editor as well. Someone who's going to animate your video. If you want to put titles on it, if you want to do any sort of mapping annotations in the actual video, someone who's using special software like After Effects, any sort of the Adobe After Effects or manipulating programs. Someone who's going to research your data, a social media expert, a web designer or a developer, project editor, a legal expert, specifically for ethics and air law. I mean, many of these things can be one person. I, for example, try to do all these things myself. And on a budget, probably you will try to do all these things yourself. But to know what you're getting into beforehand is really important. So you can budget your time and also mitigate your risk. If you do have a team and you're thinking about using a team to do these drone stories, have you managed a team like this before? Have you managed a team where you have multiple audiovisual elements, you have multiple production elements in the field, and then the whole like writing, editing back, the thing that happens back in the office, set up, prepared to do these stories? If not, then perhaps getting that in place before you purchase your drone might be a good idea. Let's talk about the drone pilots. Is the drone pilot the drone storyteller? Oftentimes, yes. So in the projects that I showed you earlier, I was the drone pilot, I was the photographer, I was the editor, I was the writer, and to some extent, I did all the other things as well, or I at least helped with them. So I helped do the data mapping, I helped do the social media posts, I helped do the After Effects. There was a lot of different components that I tried to do myself because of budget. Code for Africa is an NGO with a very small team. We didn't have a very big budget to do all of these things. And I had to train on my own time with YouTube and with my previous knowledge of video and photo to be able to be prepared to tell those stories. Again, I'll just reinforce also the drone pilot also has the legal responsibility for everything that happens during the drone flight. So just keep that in your mind as well. Legally, it's the pilot that's responsible. So who's a drone pilot? Again, the person who's ultimately responsible for the operation and safety of a drone during flight. I did go into the Mexican regulations, and if you want to fly commercially, so there's always a distinction between recreationally and commercially. Recreationally means you're just flying the drone for fun and you're not making money with it. Commercially means you're working with the drone and you're making money from it. If you want to fly commercially, you have to be at least 18 years old. You have to be Mexican by birth. That's kind of crazy. You have to be Mexican, born in Mexico. You have to provide your military release card. I don't even know what that means. You have to have a high school diploma. Again, I think that's kind of crazy. You have to be in good health. And I've put a link into the notes that Andrea has sent to you, showing a little bit more about what you need in terms of a Mexican commercial pilot requirement. But it's just to show you that if you want Johnny Miller's opinion, it's too onerous. It's too hard to become a drone pilot in many countries around the world, Mexico and South Africa. The USA makes it very easy to become a drone pilot. And I'm not saying this because I'm an American. I'm saying this because I believe it's a democratic, enabling technology that allows us to tell stories about our own neighborhoods and about our own people. Why would you want to prevent people from doing that? Now, a lot of people will say it's because of safety. If you have people who don't know what they're doing, they'll fly drones into airplanes and crash them into buildings. But the counterpoint to that is it's never happened. There's never been an aircraft crashed because it flew into a drone. And drones have become much safer. So there's sensors all over the drone, which we'll talk about, which prevent it from crashing into objects. And there's geofences. So basically a digital fence that the drone can never enter closer to an airport because of the software that it's using. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's just my own personal opinion. I think it's crazy how difficult it is to legally fly a drone. And this is something that you need to consider. Am I willing to enter into that gray zone? Am I willing to sort of go for it and tell these stories, even though I may not have my official card? I don't know. That's something that you'll have to decide for yourself. Is it worth the risk? Again, becoming a drone pilot, if you do decide to become a drone pilot legally, to have your actual commercial pilot's license, or even if you just decide to do it and fly recreationally, you have to consider these things. Cost of buying a drone, time to learn to fly the drone. We consider the time to learn to fly a drone, AfricanDRONE considers 20 to 30 battery cycles. That's more or less 15 to 20 hours of flying a drone before I would consider you proficient to go out into the field and do it on your own. Legal responsibility, the mastery of the other skills that come along with being a pilot, the maintenance and the upkeep of your drone itself. There's not a whole lot of maintenance in a drone, but kind of selling them and getting the latest technology is what I'm talking about there. Safety and security. Drones are quite valuable, and a lot of people see that you're flying them in the field because they're noisy. So your personal safety, where are you going to store them? How are you going to ensure that they don't get stolen, you don't get robbed, or they don't hit something on the ground, they break, and then you have to repair that. And then future proofing. Again, what I'm talking about is upgrading your drones for new versions of that drone. Those are some of the considerations. Okay. let's consider that you've become a drone pilot and your organization wants to support you. Andrea, did you have a question?
Yeah, Johnny, just because you suggested to interrupt you, and I'm sorry I changed my mind, but this is a relevant question. Like to fly a drone legally in Mexico, but for recreational purposes, is it something required? I understood that there is nothing, but
So from what I can see, yes, there is one thing that's required. So technically, if you fly a drone in Mexico, and by the way, this is just me looking on the internet. I'm not a Mexican citizen, and I certainly don't want to give you legal advice. So do your own research, please. But it looks like if your drone is less than 2 kilograms, there's no regulations about registering that drone. You need to fly it at least 9 kilometers away, 9.2 kilometers away from an airport. You can't fly it higher than 400 feet. You can't fly it at night. You have to be able to see the drone when you're flying it. You can't fly into clouds. You can't fly over the tops of people. You can't fly over roads. You can't fly very close to buildings. These are some of the regulations that I'm remembering that are very similar in other countries. But you don't need a special license and you don't need to register your drone. So essentially, if you're in an open field, if you're somewhere rural, you can fly your drone. Even if you're in a city and you're kind of like in a park or something like that, and you're far enough away from the airport, legally, you should be able to fly your drone legally. Where you get into problems is if you're in a city and you start flying over the tops of buildings and people, or you're close to the airport, or you have a big drone. So I hope that allays your fears a little bit. For our in-person training in Mexico, we're going to be doing this in a kind of rural area. There won't be people or buildings around. We're gonna be as legal as we possibly can. We're not going to be close to an airport. If you want my opinion also on what if you were to break a rule, it's very rare that anyone on the ground is even going to know that you broke a rule, right? It's not like there's some sort of all-seeing Wizard of Oz that can tell when you've broke a rule in the air. There's just not that technology. So unless someone sees you flying a drone next to an airport, or you put footage onto YouTube of you flying next to Mexico City International Airport and there's planes going next to the drone, no one's going to know that you broke the rules. So the enforcement of the rules is low, not only in Mexico, but in America and every country around the world, because there's just not that many resources to enforce drone laws. Still be careful. I'm going to keep talking about safety over and over, because I really feel like safety is more important than flying 100% to the letter of the law. That's probably not the UN university position. So that's Johnny Miller's position. You should always first be completely safe with what you're doing. That's your first consideration, and then move on to whether or not am I flying legally, to the regulations. Because oftentimes, if you're a journalist and you need to tell a story, you may need to cross a road or you may need to fly over a building to get there. And what I'm trying to teach to you is there are ways to do that safely and ethically. And they may skirt around the edges in the gray area of what the regulations say is possible. But you need to be aware of all of this stuff and make your own decisions. Make your own decisions on the risk of what you're doing, Can we move on, Andrea?
Yes, great. Thanks, Jenny. Just for the matter of time, just remember that we have 1 hour to go. And there was another question related to ethical issues before going into production. So I already answered that we're going to talk about ethical code in the following slides.
Okay. I'm going to move a little bit faster then. The pre-production, what we've already talked about, essentially, that's when you're sitting with your team coming up with the idea of how we're going to use drones to tell the story. That involves your production plan. That involves whether or not there's other data, satellite images that already exist, stock images that already exist, photos on the ground. Can we use those instead of the drone images? As we just talked about, all of those things will prevent you from going out into the field with your drone and potentially being in a risky situation. So are there ways to mitigate risk and mitigate your safety exposure? Yes. If all of those things are not possible and you need to go fly your drone, then you move on. This essentially is in the slides, you'll be able to look at this, but essentially the production in the field. How are you keeping yourself safe? How are you paying attention to possible risks? There's a really interesting tool that we have on our website. This is AfricanDRONE.org. So I'm sure it's been sent out to you, the link, but we've got a map of the world. You can click on your country and you can see the actual drone law from Mexico, from Argentina, from South Africa, America. So if you go to that website and you click on your country, you don't have to listen to me. You can see exactly what's written in the Mexican Civil Aviation Authority requirements. This is a short video. I do want to show it just because it gives you a sense of what you would think about when you're in the field about to fly your drone to keep yourself safe.
Before you take to the skies, it is vital to brief your crew and spectators on the following aspects: orientation, safety, and threats. Let's begin with the orientation. Find your location and determine what airspace you are currently in. For this example, we will use Cranfield Aviation Training. It is important to list your relative location to landmarks that can be referred to by other air traffic. This you will ascertain in your pre-site planning, and you will physically point out the direction on site. You should also tell your crew about any nearby access roads in case of emergencies. Also point out where your operating area will be. Let's move on to the safety briefing. Now point out and mention locations and the checks that were completed for your fire extinguisher, first aid kit, this should be packed in accordance to the CAT 91, where your emergency response plan is located, and where your emergency assembly point will be. Moving on to the threats. When evaluating threats in your area of operations, divide the area into high, medium, and low-level threats. High-level threats will be low-level traffic, your weather, mention what you see, clouds, visibility, windy conditions, birds in the area, and also your sun position. Medium-level threats will be objects in your direct line of sight, such as trees, any electric fencing, windsocks, power lines, buildings, and any access roads around your area. Low-level threats will be objects to the ground, like your safety zone, any terrain if there's any uneven ground or sloping, wildlife like snakes, lizards, bugs, or any vegetation that might cause an issue. Once you have completed your briefings and checks of your equipment.
Okay, let's stop there before we get into the controller. Definitely make sure there's no snakes around when you're flying your drone. That's critical. No, it's kind of a boring video, but it gives you the idea that there's a lot that goes into preparing your drone's flight. Going into navigation, weather, air law, threats on the ground, threats in the sky, using different apps to track air traffic, to keep yourself safe personally. There's a lot going on. Generally, what we like to say is there should be 2 people always on site with you flying your drone. Oftentimes I'm doing everything by myself and I hate it. It's dangerous. Oftentimes it's because of the budget that I have, which is 0. If you do have a friend or a budget, please bring 2 people out there. It makes everything much more safe, and then the pilot can just focus on what they're doing without worrying about everything else in the world that's happening. Things can go wrong really quickly when flying a drone, and spatially, the way the drone manipulates itself in the air is quite confusing, especially when you're just starting. So having another person there to keep you safe is really, and to keep you on track is really a benefit. Let's go quickly through drone ethics. I actually don't want to go quickly through it just because ethics are, besides safety, kind of the number one concern I think that we should be talking about when we're talking about drone flying. There are legal and sort of political considerations with flying the drone, but there's also ethical considerations. If you're used to telling stories as a journalist or as a photojournalist, you should already be well versed in the ethical narratives and the ethical considerations in your own country. So in Mexico, there's particular cultural sensitivity, there's legal sensitivity, and then there's just sort of common sense when it comes to telling stories of people. You may never have thought about flying over the tops of someone and taking their photo before, but you have to ask yourself, is this ethical, what I'm doing? Does someone have a reasonable right to privacy in their own backyard? In America, for example, you don't. Legally, you can take photos of someone in their backyard. In South Africa, you can't. I have not gone into the actual legal and sort of precedent of libel and privacy law in Mexico or Argentina to know well enough to tell you whether or not it's more like the American system or the South African system. But I'm guessing it's more like the South African system because most countries are, which basically means that you cannot expect to take a photo of someone in a private area and have them be okay with that. America's kind of an outlier on that. But if you're high enough and you can't identify that person, well, then you're getting into a bit of a gray area. So we've got an ethical document on our website. AfricanDRONE has our own drone ethics document that I encourage you to look at. Essentially, it talks about flying safely, keeping privacy in mind, and then also using your drone storytelling ability with integrity. Those 3 points will allow you to be flying in an ethical way, at least as we consider ethics to mean. So you're not being risky, you're keeping people's privacy in mind, even though you may be taking photos where people can be seen. Perhaps you're flying at a high enough altitude where you can't see their identifying characteristics. That's something that I would consider an ethical flight, right? If you're flying 10 meters above someone and you can see their entire backyard, not ethical. That's a very simplistic example, but I think you can see where I'm going with this. And then integrity, not trying to manipulate the data, not photoshopping things, not intentionally and willfully misrepresenting what you're showing. That would be an ethical way of completing a drone story or drone journalism. Okay, in the field production, kind of what that video that we watched, what they were talking about. Some elements that you need to think about in every scenario are your safety, your production plan, how you manage your data, and then how you're collaborating with the other people on your team, and then also other drone pilots. I think we've talked about a lot of these actually, so I'm going to kind of skip over this, but safety is huge. Make sure that the threats are mitigated, that you've got the training to do what you need to do. Your production plan is in place so that you know what you're doing. You're not wasting time. You're not flying around in circles until you figure out what you need, bothering people, but you know exactly where you need to go, what you need to take a photo of, and how you're going to land safely. Data management. Are you going to download the footage in the field? For example, a drone has an SD card on the drone. That's how it captures its footage, how it saves it. It doesn't save it on your phone. It saves it on the drone itself in an SD card, a little memory card. If the drone crashes and that card breaks, you lose all your footage. It's happened to me. I thought maybe you could piece it back together with tape or something. You can't. If you break an SD card, solid state SD card, it's gone forever. So oftentimes what I'll do is download all the footage, each flight, onto my computer and have a completely new SD card for every battery, every flight. So if I'm making 5 flights during the day, I've downloaded 5 different times the data. That requires a laptop in the field. It requires a hard drive in the field, and hopefully a second hard drive that you can daisy chain and make redundant the first amount of data. It also requires batteries. Can you power everything in the field? These are a lot of things to think about that people might get stuck the first time they go out into the field, or they may never think about it, and then they'll get burned when their drone crashes or when their hard drive fails with only one drive. Lastly, collaboration, making sure that you're always checking in with your partner, with the team back in the office. Am I getting what I need to be getting? Because normally you only get one chance in the field to capture your data. Then the weather changes, you don't have access anymore. It's expensive to go out into the field. You want to do everything that first day, that first flight, get as much possible as done, because you never know when you're going to go back out there or if you're going to go back out there. Okay, this, I think I've already said this, but the hot tip at the bottom there is pretty important. Just pay attention to that app. I would say if you're interested in becoming a drone pilot, download that app immediately. We'll talk about it when we're in the field in Mexico, Flight Radar 24. It shows you all the airplanes in the vicinity and the helicopters for that matter, anything with a transponder. And that and a weather app on your phone are the 2 most important things that you can use in order to keep your drone and you safe on the ground as you're flying. I'm going to skip past this. This is another example of a drone journalism story where a lot of these things had to come together in order to get the shot of this train in a slum in Kenya. So you can imagine trying to tell the story of a train in Kenya. How do you keep yourself safe? How do you prevent the drone from crashing into other aircraft or buildings? How do you do this legally and ethically? It's just an example of something that I had to do where all these things came together. Hopefully it's something that you'll have to do very soon as well, because it's exciting and fun, and these stories have great impact. Okay, let's move through editing and writing real quick. This is something that your story will come together with editing and writing. Your drone data needs to meaningfully contribute to your story. It shouldn't just be a random photo from a drone that makes it a drone story. It should meaningfully contribute to the writing process, to the data process of your story. So, does the total story make sense? Did you collect the data ethically? Are you highlighting the drone aspect of what you did? Consider stepping back often and asking yourself and asking other people, does this story make sense? The things that I did with the drone, do they make sense? Does this seem like a gimmick, or does this actually seem like a legitimate drone story with a fundamental, using the drone as a fundamental part of the data collection? Check in with people about that. Do you need more material? Do you need to go back out into the field and get more material? Have you learned any new skills? There's some excellent tutorials on multimedia storytelling and asking yourself these questions on our website. If you're interested in learning more about what that might look like, this whole like writing, editing, evaluation process of actually putting the story together. Finally, publication. So drone storytelling can be confusing. It's quite technical. If you think of just video editing in general, can be quite technical. Putting together a story where you've got video plus photos plus writing plus maybe a map, it can be very cumbersome for the reader. So far from being an afterthought, have you planned for this? And what is your publishing partner's opinion on what you actually technically can do? As I mentioned before, we had a publishing partner in South Africa, News 24, who wasn't able to publish our maps that we created with the drone data because the actual file format was not something that they had ever worked with before. And it was also quite cumbersome. It was heavy. So we had to use a separate software in order to show that data on the News 24 website. And it was a pain in the butt, honestly. It was something that we hadn't planned for. We wasted a lot of time dealing with it. And the second time was much faster. So if you can deal with that beforehand, you're going to save yourself a lot of grief. So some things to consider. Important. Who is the IT or the web liaison at your publishing partner? Identifying that person. Is your project accessible? If people in Mexico are using phones with not a lot of data, or if data is very expensive, are they going to be downloading your video? Are they going to be looking at these maps, which are they require a very high, powerful phone to look at? Are your consumers looking at your stories from a phone or from their desktop? In Africa, it's almost always with a phone. So these are some things to think about as you're actually considering your publication partner. And lastly, promotion. Your story is only really worth doing if people see it. I know that that's probably kind of a harsh realization to people, but we're not working in a vacuum. If you consider yourself an activist, or you consider yourself a person who wants to influence people through your work, whether by telling truth about an issue or about convincing someone of the benefits of some issue on the ground or the harm, it's only really valuable if people see your work. It's only valuable unless people can actually witness and have their minds changed. So have you considered a social media plan, or a dedicated editor, or an advertising budget, your SEO, entering your storytelling into award competitions, even just having a goal, benchmarks. And lastly, as we talked about, hey, how much does that thing cost? This is something that everyone will ask you. Actually, there's 3 questions people will ask you. 1, how much does it cost? 2, how far does it fly? And then lastly, how long does the battery last? So the answer is usually about $1,000, to more or less 5 kilometers, and then 3, 30 minutes, more or less. Those are the 3 questions you just need to always be prepared to answer. Let's take a brief break, just a minute or so. And Andrea, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer before we go into the actual flight controls of the drone, which I'm sure a lot of people are very excited to get to. That's what's up next. I'll just be real quick. DJI is the name of the company. It's a Chinese company that is like the behemoth, the hegemon of the drone world. And so if you're looking to buy a drone, I recommend DJI only because they're the biggest drone manufacturer by far. They're not the cheapest, but their software is extremely good. So every drone is pretty reliable these days, the hardware of the drone, but the software, the actual app, DJI has the best app. And just because of the fact that it's everywhere and it's so obvious when you show up with the DJI drone, everyone knows exactly what it's going to do, and everyone's familiar with it that has used a drone. That's the one I would recommend. The ones we're bringing to Mexico, they are small. So they make a small version called the Mini now, which you don't have to register in America. It looks like in Mexico, it's a 2 kilogram or lower. You don't have to register. You don't really have to worry about that anyways. But it's about $700 or so. And if you buy extra things, it's like $1,000. So it's not super cheap. But like I said, it's the most reliable, the safest, the best app. That's not really low cost. I wouldn't get anything less than that though. I think it's a waste of money, honestly. I think you might end up crashing it and then being out $400 or $500. Whereas if you spend $700, you'd still have a drone because it's safer. It's got all the sensors on it, if that makes sense. The second question is much more complex. And really, it's a question of ethics as much as it is about storytelling. And at Code for Africa and at AfricanDRONE, we're both NPOs, nonprofit organizations. And we have a mandate to tell stories and to help people use drones for good. Literally, that's in our charter. In my personal capacity as a photographer, that's also how I see my drone work, is using drones for good, which means not using drones to surveil or to drop bombs or to work with an oil company, things like that. So that's number one. Number two, flying over the tops of people, taking their images and then telling stories about people is oftentimes ethically problematic. So engaging with that narrative, having these kind of conversations, and especially having conversations with people on the ground, is really, really important as a drone pilot. I've had many conversations with many different groups and individuals about this particular topic, and no one ever leaves completely happy. So I hate to tell you that if you fly drones, you will not make everyone happy. There's always going to be people that say you can never fly a drone over the tops of anyone without their permission. But it's just not possible because of the fact that drones have such a wide angle of view. If you fly in Mexico City, which I have, for example, in Ciudad Nezahualcóyotl, I think, right, Andrea? That huge.
Jairo, ayúdanos, por favor.
It's Nezahualcóyotl, I'm not pronouncing it right, but there's about 4 million people. Yeah, about 4 million people that live in this neighborhood. That is just like a huge concrete jungle. It's amazing. And I really wanted to showcase what that looked like from a drone because of the project that I was doing on slums in different cities around the world. I know that that term is problematic, slum. And we had a local partner and we had everything in place to do this shoot safely, and I considered ethically. But from the air, you're able to see literally hundreds of thousands of people at the same time. So legally, in America at least, there is clear precedent for this. It's okay to take photos from an airplane or a helicopter and publish those photos. In Mexico, it's a different country and it's a different legal system. I don't know 100% whether or not that's legal, but I can almost guarantee that it would be, because if you're flying in a helicopter or an airplane, there's a long precedent in many countries around the world where that's been figured out in court, that it's okay to take a photo as you're flying if you're high enough that you can't really identify people. But the drone does add another wrinkle because you're commanding it from the ground as a remote controlled object. So I don't have good answers for you except to say, use common sense, use your ethical brain and work with partners on the ground, and be prepared to have these conversations, because there's no clear answer. If there's a policeman who's walking around, even if you're doing everything ethically and correct, he will probably question you what you're doing. If there's an angry person on the ground who's saying, don't fly the drone above me, be prepared to say, this is what I'm doing, I will land it, or this is what I'm doing and I'll continue to fly it. But have that in your mind prepared so you're not scared or discombobulated when the drone is in the air as a safety threat. So normally what we would recommend is to land the drone before having those conversations. This is not going to be a satisfying answer, so I apologize, and I kind of need to move on. But just like any photojournalist, entering a community with the support of that community is fundamental. So maybe I'll just leave it there. But yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you.
I oftentimes get asked this, especially as an American flying in Africa, because there's also an added sort of colonial and racial dynamic to the flights that I make. And again, I sleep well at night because I know that my project is helping people, and I know that I'm flying as safely and ethically as I possibly can. But there are people who have big problems with my project. So I admit that candidly to you. Thank you. Moving on, this module is going to provide you an overview on what we call drones, the flight controls, and then the data that's coming out of those drones. So by data, I mean the photos, the videos, the maps, and how to manipulate that data for the best use. You will not learn how to fly a drone in the next 30 minutes. The only way to learn how to fly a drone is to go into the field and actually fly the drone. And as I mentioned before, generally speaking, 15 to 20 battery cycles is more or less what I would consider the baseline to be proficient in flying a drone. It doesn't mean that you're going to be completely a great pilot, but at least you'll not crash it immediately and you'll feel fairly comfortable. But that's like 10 to 20 hours of flying a drone, right? So that's a lot of work that you need to put in. Drones are fairly safe, but there's still risks, and we're going to talk about those. So when you're practicing, again, practice in a rural area away from people in a clear daylight conditions, no weather, no rain, no airplanes, no people, no buildings. And I think you'll be surprised how quickly you progress and how safe it feels. But still, you need time for sure. So real quick, what is a drone? Maybe this should have been the first slide. A drone that you're going to see in Mexico, in Argentina, is the one on the left. That is a multi-rotor drone. That's a DJI drone, but they all look like that. It's got 4 rotors. It's called a multi-rotor or a quadcopter, and it can go straight up and straight down. The drone on the right, you may see sometimes, which is a fixed wing drone like an airplane, and it needs to keep moving like an airplane does. It's not a helicopter, it's like an airplane, and it has to keep moving around. You might see those for mapping, but you're probably not going to see those for photography. Lastly, there's a new class of drones, which you may have heard of, called FPV drones. FPV stands for first person view. And people will wear the goggles and they'll fly these around very quickly. It's quite an exciting type of a drone. I'll show you an example here. This is an example of an FPV drone flight. So we don't have to watch the whole video. I just wanted to show you that FPVs are being used more and more in commercials and movies. They're incredible. You can actually fly them into a car or through a window or something like that because they're very small and light. And if they hit something, they don't hurt the thing and they don't break the drone. The drones we're going to be using in Mexico and Argentina are not like that. They're heavier. The propellers are unguarded, so you don't want to hit things and you can't fly as aggressively. You can see in the slide here what the different parts of a drone are. This is an example of a drone we might be using. You've got the brain, which is essentially the flight control unit and the GPS to keep it in position. You've got the propellers. So those are like the things that make it fly and turn and go up and down and move. You've got the controller. So there's radio on the drone that sends an image to the controller so you can see what you're doing. And then the controller can send a message back to actually manipulate the drone. And you've also got the camera. So obviously the camera and the gimbal on the drone are what makes you be able to collect the data. Of course, you've also got the laptop there to prepare everything. You don't need to map out your flights. You can just fly using the controller and the phone. But the computer is there in case you wanted to fly and plan waypoints or do some sort of mapping project as well. I want to just focus real quick on the gimbal. The gimbal is this invention, I should say a miniaturization of a technology that's existed for a long time. But this is why drones are so important, is because there's little tiny motors, little tiny gyroscopes inside this apparatus called a gimbal that the camera sits on. And those gimbals keep the camera steady. So remember that very first video that we watched of the protest in Poland and how it was kind of shaky? Well, these new gimbals, it will never be shaky anymore. So all the video and all the photos you take are going to be crystal clear. It's going to be smooth and amazing because of these gimbals. That allows you to kind of do whatever you want with a drone, even in wind, even when the drone is moving. It's quite a revolution, and that's something to pay attention to, especially keeping it clean and protecting it in terms of your storage and your maintenance of your drone. There's always a controller. Now we'll talk in the next slide about how the controller works. But you've got the drone, and then the controller controls the drone remotely. So via radio, sometimes you use your phone, sometimes there's a screen built into the controller itself. But in both cases, there's an app running on the phone or the screen. And the app is what shows you all the telemetry data, the map, the GPS, your controls for your camera, etc. So it's critical. It's a critical part of the drone flying process. Sometimes people ask me, well, what happens if you break the controller or the battery runs out? The drones are very safe these days. They've got sensors all over them so that a drone won't fly into a wall. It's got GPS so that the drone always knows where it is in the air and where it took off from the ground. And so if the controller or the drone loses connection, the drone will actually stop in midair. It'll just hover there. It won't keep flying. It'll just hover. And eventually it'll come back to the same location and land itself automatically. It's like magic. This is something that is different than when I started using drones, and it's much, much, much safer now. So the controller. You can see the controller is quite complicated. This is why I say it normally takes between 10 and 15 battery cycles. So draining your whole battery, flying it for a half hour or so before you kind of become proficient. Because of the fact that seeing the drone in the air, doing the things that you're telling it to do with your thumbs takes a while. Unless you're a really good video game player, which I never was, it's difficult to remember if you press right, the drone will go right unless it's facing back towards you, and then it'll go left because the drone turns around in midair, right? You have to manipulate the drone in your mind in 360-degree space while it's 200 meters away from you. Not everyone finds this very easy. So this is really what we're going to be practicing on the ground in Mexico, is getting to the point where we can manipulate things without thinking too hard about it. Some people are really good at it right off the bat. I was kind of in between, and I definitely remember crashing my drone into a tree because I pressed right when I was supposed to press left. Because back in the day, the drones didn't have those sensors all over them. So now that the drones have these sensors, that's impossible to do. The drone will see the tree and you won't be able to crash it into the tree. The flight controls, you don't really have to know what this means because we'll practice it in the field. But this is the 4 basic flight controls of any drone: the yaw, the throttle, the pitch, and the roll. And it's generally laid out like this, although you can change what your thumbs control. But this is a standard, this one. And what do we mean by that? The pitch axis basically makes the drone go forward or go back. The roll axis makes it go left or go right. And then the yaw makes it rotate around the center. So if you imagine a helicopter hovering in the sky and it rotates to look left or it rotates to look right, that's yaw. that's the one that most people have problems with, is yaw. Pitch and roll are pretty obvious. Again, when you're in the field and you see what this feels like with your thumbs, things will start to make potentially a little bit more sense. Here's a little video explaining that. Yeah, and Andrea just shared an important link, but here's a little video where you kind of see what I'm talking about.
Flying a drone for the first time can be tricky. Here are some tips to keep in mind before taking to the sky. You can practice on the ground with a simulator app like Parrot's AR Drone Sim or the Flight Simulator from 3DR. When you're ready for the real world, choose a wide open area away from power lines, trees, and people. Do a pre-flight check, making sure the battery is secured and propellers are attached. If it's your first flight, consider using the easy flight mode if your drone has it.
All you're going to do is just push up on the throttle, and it's going to take off.
Practice hovering the drone and slowly increase elevation as you get the hang of it. Then try basic movements with the controller like altering pitch and yaw.
You always want to keep your eyes on the aircraft, so that way you're making sure that you're not going to fly into anything, and just take it slow.
It's a good idea to position the camera facing away from you.
And so at this point, when you push forward on the stick, it's going to go forward. When you push back on the stick, it's going to go back. Left is going to be left, right is going to be right.
Some drones have a built-in GPS feature that lets it hover in one position and then return to the same location it took off from. But it's a good idea to keep the drone within sight because sometimes GPS can lose signal. When it's time to land, bring the throttle down gently and hold. Remember, drones can crash, so if it happens, and it probably will, release the throttle immediately.
Your drone will not crash. The drones nowadays have very good GPS signal, so they will not lose GPS. And also they've got those sensors all over them, like I said. So that's a little bit of an old video, but it does give you a good understanding of what she has to do with her thumbs to make the drone change in the sky. And like I said, that send drone home button, if you press the button on your controller, it will always bring the drone home. If you look at the app, so this is a screenshot of the app you see on your screen right now. The lower left-hand corner, that's a map. It's a GPS map. The drone that I have that we're going to bring to Mexico, it actually requires you to have an internet connection in order to take off, and it will have that map, and then you will see where your drone is and where you are, at least in the beginning of the flight. And you can see how far away you are, at what speed you're going, how high in the sky you are, how many minutes you have left, and the percentage of your battery, the signal strength, your camera functions, which we'll talk about in the next couple slides, and the sensors. So those sensors on the bottom there's a yellow and a green semicircle, and it says 26 feet. That's the distance between the front of the drone and the threat being these trees. So you can see these drones are very, very safe and accurate in terms of understanding the world around them. And it's almost impossible to crash your drone these days, although it's almost impossible, but it's not impossible. So that's a good thing. You will essentially be successful immediately by flying drones these days. Real quick, this is what an air map looks like of my hometown of Seattle. It's very complicated, and there's a lot to understand. But if you become a professional drone pilot, a commercial drone pilot, this is something that you'll have to understand, because flying next to and around controlled airspace, Mexico City has very complicated controlled airspace, is vital in terms of being able to be safe when you fly your drone. So I just wanted to show this to you, not to scare you, but just to let you know that these are some of the things you're going to have to think about before you become a commercial drone pilot. Now, that app I told you about, that Flight 24 app, Flight Radar 24, kind of gives you a dumbed down version of this map. So that's something that you can use And we'll talk about that in the field to keep yourself safe. Safety first. Again, that's the number one thing when you're in the field, before ethics and before regulations, is safety. So yes, understand and follow the regulations. Yes, perform a pre-flight check. Choose a safe flying location. Fly at a safe altitude. As I mentioned, almost every country in the world has 400 feet as the limit in terms of how high you can fly. American standards for aviation are all over the world. I don't know why. So it's not 120 meters, 400 feet. Fly in good weather conditions, which means sunny, no clouds, not raining. Maintain visual contact with the drone, which means it can't fly very far away from you. You have to be able to see it at all times. You can't fly at nighttime. And then if possible, team up, fly with a partner. Those are the safety recommendations that I would give as a baseline, as a basic. Maybe we don't have to take a break here. Andrea shaking her head also. But I want you to just think, what scares you the most about flying a drone? And what are you most excited about? Those are two things that I think will help you accurately sort of understand whether or not you want to become a drone pilot, or some questions to ask me in the field when we're out there that should immediately be brought to the attention. If you're scared of anything or if something doesn't make you feel comfortable, it's such a high risky thing to do. Let's talk about it. Let's figure it out before the drone goes up into the air. I didn't go into it with these slides, but there's something in American, like if you're becoming a pilot in America, at least, probably also in Mexico, and you're getting your pilot's license, there's a big part of the test that talks about decision-making practices. Because when you're a pilot in the air and things are going wrong, things can go really wrong really fast. For example, if you've been drinking, or if you're tired, or if you've got some medical issue, and then something on the airplane also goes wrong, and there's bad weather, these things can start to stack up on top of one another, and very quickly you can lose control of the airplane and cause a crash. It's not as dramatic with drones, but it's the same principle. So if you're distracted in the field because there's a group of kids around you, for example, this happens to me all the time. Let's say you're by yourself. You're in a field, kids hear the drone and they come out and they surround you, and there's clouds moving in. Let's say there's rain that's coming in, and you've only got maybe 30 minutes to be able to get the shot. So now you have to deal with all of this stuff at the same time. There's a lot of pressure, and you can easily make mistakes if you're not well trained. So mitigating those dangers, those sort of outside controls and risks, is something that another person helps a lot with. So that's my main takeaway, is to have another partner be there as a safety support. Okay.
Johnny, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I will suggest that this part of the content that people can follow on their own, but maybe we jump to module 3, to the introduction to drone mapping, because I think that's the most complex part for everybody to understand autonomously.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would say take a look at the slides. I'm a photographer, and I have seen my work be more successful because of the fact that I know how to take a good photo than other people's work where they don't know how to take as good of a photo. It's just the way that humans access information these days. We're all very well attuned to a good photo because we're all looking at our phones all the time. We're all looking at Instagram, we're all looking at Twitter, we're all looking at the web. And there's professional photos that we see every minute of the day. So taking better photos will actually help your story progress and be seen by more people. So I'll skip through some of this. I agree, maybe it's not
84.
totally necessary.
Yeah, and we also did a training in photography. Les recuerdo que hicimos un entrenamiento también en fotografía, donde vimos estos conceptos básicos. vamos a saltar esta sección, pero queda el material para que por favor lo revisen entre la diapositiva 70 a la 84. Gracias.
Okay, in the last 15 minutes or so, let's talk quickly about drone mapping. I mentioned that there's a few different ways that you can collect data with drones. There's photography, there's videography. You can actually attach sensors to the drone, for example, gas sensors, infrared sensors. That's a bit more complicated. The last one, which you don't have to use any special equipment for, is mapping, right? Because mapping just involves photos. So all you're doing is taking a lot of different photos, stitching them together and making a map, and sometimes a 3D model. This photo that you're looking at right now, all those, let me take a look, all those little green balls, that's where a photo was taken, right? And so you can see all the different photos that this person flew over a quarry, and then the computer stitches them all together. Because the drone has GPS, the computer knows where the photos were taken, and all those things stitched together create a map. I might skip past this video, but take a look at it. It definitely gives you an understanding of what photogrammetry means, because it's a complicated topic, but I'm going to skip it.
Photogrammetry is the science of making measurements from photographs.
So yeah, essentially photogrammetry is the science of making a map out of multiple individual photos. This is a map that I took in Rio de Janeiro of Copacabana Beach. There's about 500 photos in this one map. You can see it's something that you would never be able to get except from a satellite. And you might be asking yourself, well, why am I just not using Google Earth? The thing is, you can use Google Earth, but you don't own the data. Google does, right? So sometimes that's important to people. And secondly, and this is why I use it, the definition. If you zoom way down into Google, you'll realize it's actually not that sharp. The images that Google's use are from companies that generally have a base level of 31 centimeters per pixel. Sometimes, like in Israel, for example, it's 50 centimeters per pixel. So different parts of the world have different resolutions. With a drone, it can be as sharp as you want it, because it just depends how low you fly to the ground. So this image, for example, has about, I think, a 2 to 3 centimeter per pixel. So that's 10 times or an order of magnitude better than Google. So you can zoom right in on this image and you can see individuals on the beach there underneath their umbrellas, or you can see the cars on the street there. It's quite a high resolution image. The next part of creating a map is actually putting it on a map of the Earth. Because of the fact that drones use GPS, they know, or I should say the drone software knows exactly where each image sits on the Earth. So this map of Kibera, which is a slum area of Nairobi, the government was building a road through the middle of it. And because of the fact that the satellites didn't pass over this area very often, we wanted to create a map of what the actual bulldozed road looked like before they started building on it. And so we actually flew a drone over this area, and we took the images, we made a map, and then we put the map onto OpenStreetMaps, which is a software, open source software that people use to look at the world. Essentially, it's an NPO. I don't know where it's based. OpenStreetMap. You can Google it. And this map then sits right on there automatically. You can also do this in Google Earth. You can do this in a lot of different softwares. But this is really important if you're an activist, a lawyer, human rights advocate, anyone that wants to have proof that something is happening in a particular place on Earth. You can do it with a drone very, very quickly. You can also do it very cheaply, because sometimes the software, there's trial versions of the software where they allow you to do things for free for 15 days. That's how we did this project. And Google Earth, for example, is free. But if you want to pay for the software, it gets quite expensive. So sometimes we will just make free accounts whenever we want to do something like this for our clients. instead of paying multi-thousands of dollars for the license. I also want to talk quickly about 3D models. So making a map which is flat is one thing. And that's something that's very, very useful for like I said, lawyers, human rights advocates, journalists. But if you're interested in making something look a bit more interesting, and you can also do different things with a 3D model like elevation data, flood mapping analysis, animations, videos. This is Johannesburg. I actually created this using Google Earth. So you can actually use Google Earth to make these 3D models. But imagine that I flew a drone over Johannesburg. You can actually manipulate this in 3D space, and you can zoom in and out, and you can see those tall buildings. You can also do this on Google Earth. If you click the 3D icon on Google Earth in your city, in Mexico City, for example, 3D buildings will appear. I actually did this on my own using Google Earth data because of the fact that once you have the data, you can do whatever you want with it. You don't necessarily need to use Google Earth, the software, to show people a 3D model of an area. You can actually put it onto your own website. You can create a video out of it. There's a lot of things that you can do when you own the data. So if anyone's more interested in that, we can talk about it offline, or we can talk about it when I'm in Mexico, because it's quite complicated, but it's not that complicated. If you're okay with computers, if you're good with what I've been talking about to this point, if everything's making sense, you can create 3D models. Creating a drone map. There are, and Andrea just put in a link to a website that's going to be the most important website for you if you're into 3D models, which is called Sketchfab. And there are free accounts on Sketchfab. You can get a sense of what 3D models look like. Planning a drone mapping flight is very similar to planning your own drone flight if you're taking video or photos. I would say that the big difference is going to be planning out the boundaries of where you're flying and having enough battery to be able to do that. For example, this is a screenshot from Drone Deploy, which is one of the softwares that you would use with your normal drone. So you don't need a special drone. The kind of drones that I was just talking about that cost $700 that we're going to bring to Mexico, you can use the software with those drones. And essentially, you can, on your phone, with your finger, draw a boundary around an area, in this case, a field, and it will show you, based on how high you want to fly, how long it will take, and how many batteries you will need. And the drone will fly automatically. It will take off automatically. It'll fly, and then it'll land automatically, which is quite amazing. It's, again, kind of like magic. People don't really believe it until they see it. I found it hard to believe before I saw what was happening, because of the fact that this is complicated. The drone needs to take a lot of different photos at a particular periods of time, moving in particular directions. And it just does it simply and easy. And Drone Deploy is free. You have to pay for upgraded versions of Drone Deploy. But if you just want to play around with this mapping part of it, that actually is free. This video, again, since we're running out of time, I think you can watch later. But this shows the woman planning out the drone flight, having it take off and land by itself, and then her beginning to process that in the software.
Ready to start using your DJI drone to work smarter with drone?
So real quick, there was a project we did earlier this year in Malawi, which is an African country. It's very poor. And the Bezos Foundation, which is Amazon's founder, wants to reforest the world. He wants to plant trees all over the world. And in Malawi, they've cut down a lot of trees for charcoal. That's how people cook, is with wood. And they've cut down all the trees in the country, pretty much. And so what the Bezos Foundation wants to do is plant trees, replant trees. And they wanted to use us to create a map, AfricanDRONE. They wanted to use AfricanDRONE to create a map of this huge area in order to see how the trees are growing and how many trees had actually been planted, because they didn't know. And so we needed to plan out a bunch of different flights over this rural area. The drones then would fly. It took us 5 days of flying over this entire area. And then we took all those photos, thousands of photos, and put them into Pix4D, which is the other software that Andrea linked in the chat. And Pix4D linked all these photos together into one huge map of this area of Malawi, 250 hectares. This is quite a big area, thousands of images. I think it was something like 500 gigabytes of data. So you can imagine, think about the kind of computer and hard drives you're going to need to do these sorts of projects. But once it's done, we were able to have this map and zoom in all the way to see individual trees in this 250 hectare zone. And once you've got that map, you're able to use AI or other tools to actually do things like count the trees, to talk about how healthy their leaves are using vegetation analysis. If you work with animals, there's AI that will count animals. For example, if you have a cattle farm or something like that. If you're flying over, for example, a lake or a quarry, something with some volume to it, you can analyze the volume using 3D modeling techniques. This is really well suited to things like climate change. So I don't want to say what you should or should not be using drones for in your own particular context, but I know climate change is quite a pressing issue in many parts of the world. I know it's a pressing issue in Mexico. There may be something where you can imagine using a drone to monitor water, or to monitor a desert or drought or trees or something that's happening that you might need a map for. And you may need to take this at multiple points over time to create a comparison as well, maybe in the rainy season and in the dry season, and then compare them. It's relatively quick and easy to do this, whereas before you would have had to hire an airplane. Now you just need the drone. That's going to save you hundreds of thousands of dollars, and many, many skilled personnel can be reduced down to maybe 1 or 2. It's really, really a game changer. So yeah, I would say, just as one of the last slides here, maybe just write down as many applications for drone mapping that you can think of. Just scribble them down right now. Are you thinking climate change? Are you thinking urban environments? Are you thinking, I don't know, there's some phenomenon like a volcano or a forest that I want to look at that I can't find a good map for, or it's too low resolution. Well, maybe a drone is the best way to do that. And it might not be strictly journalism or storytelling. It might be other forms of data collection that you didn't even think a drone could do. But now, hopefully, after going through this presentation, you are aware that drones can do that. I'm going to skip through the last couple slides. I think basically there are some things to think about in terms of becoming a GIS expert, in terms of drone mapping that you might need to think about. There are some advancements in drone technologies that are coming that I really want you guys to pay attention to. For example, artificial intelligence is really changing the game for drones. The next video that I was going to show you, which I think we'll probably skip through, shows new swarm technology that's being developed for drones. I am in San Francisco right now, and a couple of days ago I was driving across the bridge, and there's a baseball game, San Francisco Giants baseball game, and they were having a drone show at the same time as I was going over the bridge. I couldn't believe it. I've never seen this before. And there was hundreds of drones in the sky with lights on them, and they were changing and making huge different things in the sky, like a big baseball. And then they switched and made the map of California, and then they made like fireworks. And this was all done with drones, hundreds of drones working together in what's called a swarm. Unfortunately, the war in Ukraine with Russia is really spurring a lot of innovation with drones in terms of using AI and using cheap commercial drones to do bad things. And I have to fight against that quite a bit, because using drones for good also means trying to convince people that drones aren't always used for bad. This is something that also you may run into in the field, is that when you start getting excited about artificial intelligence or using drones in a swarm, people might immediately start thinking about using them in war. Whereas, yeah, they can really be used, really be used for good as well. So I'll skip past that. It's a really cool video, though. I highly recommend watching it. And I'll end with the last slide, and we can move on to questions and answers. This is my website, unequalscenes.com. This is my Instagram handle. And in the chat, I'll also put AfricanDRONE's website address as well. I mean, please check that out. We've got operations manuals, we've got ethical guidelines and considerations, and then we've got that tool in terms of checking out your regulations wherever country you're in. And then also a whole bunch of cool YouTube videos and trainings and different topics to talk about. It is focused on Africa, but a lot of it is applicable anywhere you're based all over the world, Latin America, America, Europe, otherwise. So I just want to say thank you for your attention. Zoom is always kind of strange because I've just been staring at myself and Andrea's face this whole time and the slides. But I'm assuming that all of you are excited about what you've just learned and ready to go out into the field in Mexico and actually get your hands on a drone and start flying them. I'm really excited to be there. And yeah, I'm interested in answering any questions or comments that you have, and looking forward to the rest of our conversation. So thank you. And yeah, let's move on.
Thank you very much. Johnny, if you want, you can stop sharing your screen. And muchas gracias a todas, a todos por acompañarnos. Vamos a demorarnos un par de minutitos más. Si quieren hacer alguna pregunta, sí, ya nos vemos pronto en México, Andrea, gracias. Si quieren hacer alguna pregunta, pueden usar el micrófono vía chat. Acabo de compartir la encuesta de satisfacción y al diligenciarla van a tener la posibilidad de escoger la sesión práctica que más les convenga para que por favor la usen también. Como vieron, la información es un poquito densa, es bastante complejo, entonces la invitación es a que revisemos la información en el Padlet, a que nos actualicemos un poco en estos conceptos para aprovechar de mejor manera la sesión práctica. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, alguna duda, este es el momento. ¿No? Jairo, por favor.
Sí, quiero preguntar si ha hecho algún registro de esta inequidad, pero en zonas rurales, o solamente se ha enfocado en las ciudades. Y si es así, ¿qué es lo que ha observado?
Vale. ¿Alguien más tiene otra pregunta? Y capturamos un par. ¿Preguntas prácticas también? ¿No? Ok. Vale, gracias. So, 2 questions, Johnny. First one, if you have recorded also rural inequity, not only urban one, but if you have experienced also rural settings. And second one, where are you going to fly in Buenos Aires? Bárbara, esa es una pregunta muy avanzada en este momento. Estamos definiendo fechas para Buenos Aires, pero la idea, por supuesto, es estar sector Barrio 20. Mantendremos, por supuesto, el interés y las recomendaciones de seguridad apropiadas. Entonces, de acuerdo a la posibilidad que tengamos, definiremos el lugar, pero gracias, claro que sí. So, everybody's waiting for, Barbara is waiting for you in Barrio 20 in Buenos Aires.
Great.
Now, Jairo asked about the rural settings. Andrea, por favor.
Igual un poco complementando la pregunta de Bárbara, igual abrir el espacio para decir que si alguien de León, Naucalpan o de Buenos Aires tiene algún lugar que recomienden que cuando John vaya a las ciudades quieran que capture, pues creo que todavía estamos a tiempo de que nos digan, oigan, pues en tal colonia hay imágenes interesantes para considerarlo, porque estamos justo cerrando la agenda de John en México y bueno, en Argentina se está planteando, pues para que nos avisen si conocen un lugar específico e interesante, podamos considerarlo. Gracias.
Genial, muchas gracias, Andrea. Sí, esa es la idea. En el Padlet van a ver que para los ejercicios prácticos están las ubicaciones, tanto para León como para Naucalpa. Son es el vivero municipal en León y la sesión práctica de Naucalpan está en la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente. Son espacios seguros, controlados, con restricción de acceso al público, entonces vamos a tener una práctica mucho más tranquila. Y aquí me gustaría mencionar también la pregunta que hicimos, Johnny, when you ask what was the most frightening thing about driving a drone and what was the most exciting thing? Well, for one of the participants, losing the drone, or maybe, yeah, the wind making it unstable is the most frightening stuff, and the most exciting part is the panoramic views that you could watch, that you could see with the drone. So that's that for your information.
Cool.
Vale, muchas gracias. Okay, Ari from Villa 20, Buenos Aires, she suggests to link Barrio 20 with some water site. I will look for it in Google and then let you know. Muchas gracias, Ari. Genial, perfecto. So to link the drones mapping with somehow the environmental memory and audiovisual power that they are doing. Ari is a representative from a participatory memory archive from Buenos Aires. It's also one of our previous facilitators of a course, so it would be great if you could get together. Ari, me encantaría que te conectaras con Johnny para que puedan hacer unas tomas maravillosas. Muchas gracias. Vale, si alguien más tiene dudas, si no, muchísimas gracias por su tiempo. Bueno, 15 minutos de margen adicional. Muchas gracias. Queda la encuesta de satisfacción. Nos seguiremos comunicando vía correo electrónico. Les recuerdo que nos vemos la próxima semana en León, jueves 19, viernes 20 y en Naucalpan, lunes 23, martes 24 para las sesiones prácticas. Muchísimas gracias. Para las personas que no pudieron asistir a esta sesión, la información va a quedar grabada y en el Padlet y va a estar disponible en el Padlet para que por favor la revisen y bueno, seguimos en contacto. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Johnny. Gracias.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Gracias. Really looking